Whenever there's a discussion about the bombings conducted by the United States against Japan during World War II, there are really only ever two that come to mind and that are often mentioned, and that, of course, being the dropping of the atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a decision that to this day the efficacy of such a horrific weapon is still debated. Now, there are many reasons as to why the United States decided to use these weapons of mass destruction. Maybe that's a topic for another time. However, one thing I asked myself for a long time was, why Hiroshima and why Nagasaki? Why not hit Tokyo? Why not send a message loud and clear right at the emperor's doorstep? And to put it simply, there wasn't too much of Tokyo that was left for the United States to bomb, because just 5 months earlier, the United States conducted the deadliest air raid in history, something that still stands to this day. This is the story of the firebombing of Tokyo, known as Operation Meetinghouse. So, Operation Meetinghouse was part of the United States' bombing campaign, which the entire aim of it was to weaken industrial centers, which created the materials that were used to wage war against the U.S., as well as to weaken the morale of civilians. And nowadays, most people see the bombing of civilian targets as an absolute no-no. However, this was a different time. For example, one colonel even stated that, quote, the entire population of Japan is a proper military target, and that there are no civilians in Japan. And the reason that the United States had this view towards Japanese civilians was because we believe that Japanese civilians were expected to take up arms against the United States in the event of a mainland assault. And the United States wanted to avoid a mainland assault at most cost because the civilians were prepared to die for their emperor. They were prepared to die for their country. And estimates at the time put that there would be up to 500,000 U.S. casualties in the event of a mainland assault of Japan, which is why, instead of going for that, the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the goal of Operation Meetinghouse was to hit industrial, commercial, and even residential districts. The United States essentially wanted to create hell on earth for all of those living in Tokyo. And the effectiveness of the United States' bombing campaigns can be largely accredited to the B-29 Superfortress bombers. With a range of 3,200 miles and the ability to drop payloads from over 30,000 feet, the B-29 was able to take off from China or Guam, drop bombs from a very high altitude, and safely return. As for the munitions that the United States was going to use for this operation, rather than traditional bombs that they used in the European theater of war, like in Germany or in Italy, the United States opted to use incendiary munitions when it came to attacking Japanese cities. And so the reason they didn't use traditional bombs like they would in Germany was, European cities are mainly built of concrete and brick, and so firebombing them with incendiary munitions would not be as effective. However, Japanese cities and the homes and the buildings were largely made of paper and wood, and they were stacked very close together. And so the United States had bomb sites where they would make mock Japanese and German villages, and they would test these munitions. And they built these mock villages with impeccable detail in order to understand how effective these munitions would be. And when it came to the mock Japanese cities and the incendiary munitions, it was about as effective as you would think. And so whenever the United States would test these incendiary weapons on these mock Japanese villages, there would be nothing left. There would be maybe some nails or some wire, but it burnt it up very, very quickly. On March 9th, 1945, 334 B-29 bombers took off from the Mariana Islands and reached Tokyo just before midnight. And while these B-29 bombers are capable of dropping payloads from extremely high altitudes, this night they're going to be flying relatively low, and this was done for a couple reasons. The first one being that flying at a low altitude made it less likely that the bombers would be picked up by enemy radar, and flying at such a low altitude would also ensure that the bombers would be more accurate. So on this night they're flying between 5,000 and 9,000 feet. And the United States was not worried about their defenses, so much so that the bombers were ordered to take off all of their defensive weapons except for a tail gun. They were not concerned about Japanese fighter pilots, rallying and being a real issue for them. And dropping most of their defensive weapons also allowed them to carry a larger payload. So, after the B-29s arrived above Tokyo, they would drop their payloads, which mainly consisted of what was an M69 firebomb. And this bomb would drop out of the B-29s, and it would continue to drop until it reached around 2,000 feet. After hitting that altitude, it would deploy 38 steel canisters filled with napalm. And so from that altitude, the 38 steel canisters would begin to separate more and more, And so what would happen was from one bomb, you get a very wide area of effect. And so essentially they could take out an entire street with just one bomb because of this separation. They would get a wide area of effect. And again, the buildings are made of wood and paper. And another thing about napalm, if you don't already know, is napalm is extremely sticky. It will not get off of anything it touches, whether it be a building, whether it be a person. It's on you. You're done. And again, since the buildings in Tokyo were one house on top of another, you can imagine how many families would wake up in the night with their houses engulfed in flames with no chance of escape. And for those who were lucky enough to just make it out of their homes, they were by no means safe from what was to come. So you have paper houses and fire raining down upon them. What else could go wrong? Well, it turns out that on this night, it was an extremely windy evening with wind gusts up to 60 miles per hour. And so these high winds would effectively create fire tornadoes that, according to reports, would suck mattresses from people's homes and take them down the street. So you have fire tornadoes, as well as flying debris from these high winds. So Japanese civilians were running for their lives. However, surrounded by all the flames, the fire would suck the oxygen out of the air and people would asphyxiate. And in some areas, the temperatures reached up to 1800 degrees Fahrenheit. The city streets would begin to melt. People's clothes were literally bursting into flames on their bodies. Glass from windows was leaking onto people. Corpses littered the streets, and the only saving grace for many people was if they could make it to the river. Many firefighters and volunteers would try to combat the flames, and they would never leave their posts, and they would die doing the best they could. And there were some others that would just concede defeat 15 minutes after the bombing began. They knew their fate. The civilians were not able to run to bomb shelters either because there were not any constructed. You heard that right. The capital city of an imperial country waging war against the United States, they did not have any bomb shelters built. And that's not because they couldn't afford it or they didn't have the ability to do it. The Japanese government felt that if citizens saw bomb shelters, that would do great harm to morale. You know what else is a harm to morale? Fire tornadoes. And it was hot. The heat that was created from these incendiary munitions would cause updrafts that would lift the B-29s upwards. And there was even one instance where an updraft created a B-29 to invert. Bomber crews, while being at least 5,000 feet up, could feel the heat as well as the putrid smell of burning flesh. And whenever the B-29 bombers returned, the belly of their aircrafts was just covered with soot. And there was one instance where citizens flocked toward a school, which was a brick structure, and they knew that structure contained a swimming pool. So over 1,000 civilians went to this school and jumped into the pool in order to take shelter from the heat. However, the next day, they discovered that there was no water in the pool, just all of these bodies, and that the heat was so intense that it boiled the people alive. As the bombers flew back, they could see the glow from the fires from over 150 miles away, and over the course of the raid, of the 300 plus aircraft that was utilized by the United States, only 12 aircraft were lost, and a majority of these lost planes were due to mechanical issues. Now, some bombers were lost because they were caught in a spotlight and shot down. However, no Japanese fighter was able to take down a single bomber during this bombing run. In total, the bombing lasted about 2.5 hours. And while numbers vary, it has been concluded that over 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs were dropped during that time. And so that equates to roughly 26,600 pounds of munitions being dropped every minute. In total, roughly 16 square miles of Tokyo was completely destroyed, which was about 1/4 of the entire city. While estimates vary on the number of dead Japanese, 80,000 to 120,000, most historians estimate that the total number of dead Japanese civilians to be around 100,000. And because of this bombing, there was over 1 million people who became homeless and over 260,000 buildings were destroyed. The United States considered Operation Meetinghouse to be a very large success. However, this operation remains as a brutal testament to the realities of war and what humans are capable of in the pursuit of victory. Whether you believe the United States was justified in conducting this operation or the operations that would eventually follow, I hope we all gain a better understanding of what the horrors of war can actually look like, and I hope that it can be avoided. Thank you for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed the video, go ahead and give it a like, and if you'd be interested in seeing more marginal topics, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and comment down below what other marginal things you would like me to look into and to cover. Thank you guys.